Hello students. Today I'm going to be discussing idea number 3 in the article, The 5 Great Ideas in American Public Administration. This idea number 3 is probably one of my most favorites. It may also be the most important one out of the 5 great ideas, even though it's number 3. And I'm going to explain why. So first of all, the topic itself should give you some clue. The topic is politics and policy making. It marks a pivotal shift from ideas 1 and 2 in the field of American public administration. It challenges the earlier assumptions that administration is a neutral, technical process separated from politics. Instead, it recognizes that public administration is deeply intertwined with the political processes, the values and decision making that go on, politics and policies, which, again, it does sound familiar, yes, from what's going on today. The idea emerged as government became more complex. Expansion of the welfare state, the rise of regulations, regulatory, redistributive politics and policies. For example, under FDR, it was called, the Great New Deal, right? United States trying to get out of the Great Depression. FDR came in and made some changes, Social Security, made other changes with putting people to work. They had the FDIC created. A lot of changes happened at that time. It was the New Deal that Americans all had. And so because of that, it became very clear that the old ways, ideas 1 and 2, would not be as applicable as the idea number 3 would become now. Which is why I will probably spend at least 15 minutes on this topic, because it really is such an important topic, which, if you think about it, we're probably back there now today, right? That's what I was trying to lead into. So there's key themes and developments that I want to discuss. One is, of course, the erosion of the politics-administration dichotomy. So early public administration theorists such as Woodrow Wilson, who was a professor in Princeton and later on became the President of the United States, he advocated for a clear separation between politics, policy determination, and administration, policy implementation. This was obviously a new development, but they realized that you had to have separation. Administrators became more as policymakers. The thing is that I think all students should know this, especially as you are now master's grade students. You are master's students in public administration. And I promise you, at least 5 times in a year, if you go someplace, maybe more, and you tell to somebody, I have a master's in public administration, I guarantee to you, one of them will say to you, wow, what is public administration? I've never heard of that. Well, I've been asked that many, many times in my career. And public administration, the easiest way to define it is public administration is the implementation of policy. The implementation of policy. So as an administrator, you have policies that, let's say you are a federal worker, that Congress and the president have put into place. You are an administrator. You administer those policies. Previously, before idea number 3, this was not discussed as much. This wasn't something that was that big a deal. But as government kept expanding, it became very clear that it's become more obvious and more acceptable that 20th century analysis have widely accepted that high-level administrators, and by high-level administrators I mean people like, say, for example, Senator Marco Rubio, who's or he's not a senator anymore, he's the Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And let's say the Secretary of Defense, whose name escapes me right now. Oh, I'm sorry, Hegseth. Of course, Hegseth. These people, these individuals are high-ranking administration officials in the Trump White House. They do set the policies. They also create them with President Trump and other interested groups, of course. But it became very clear that as the 20th century progressed, especially after World War II, which it greatly expanded the United States' power and reach throughout the world. We were basically the only superpower still standing at the end of World War II. Europe was in shambles. Japan was in shambles. Russia, they were in shambles. Russia had put in 19%. They had pressed 19% of their population into the armed forces. Think about that. It's almost 1 in 5 Russians. So they lost. And they lost really badly. A lot, but it wasn't for Russia's sacrifice, which they did do, we probably may have dragged the war on for much longer. It was only because they had a two-pronged fight, the Nazis, that we were able to clobber them. They decided to attack Soviet Union, and they tried to open up a Western front with the United States. You can't win them all. So, but that was to their detriment and our benefit, because at the end of World War II, we really were the only superpower left standing. For the next decade, almost 20 years, it took a long time for Germany to rebuild itself, for Japan to rebuild itself, a very long time. We were the only ones out there. So we had a monopoly in that sense, and that greatly expanded all of the United States government powers, all of our powers that they talk about today, which is hard power, our military power, and soft power, which is our diplomatic power, a power of bribery, that we're going to give these grants to this country over here, and in return we need you to help us out with this, this, and this. Okay, well, that's all public administration. That's all part of it. So the complexity of all these modern government programs, domestic and foreign, of course, established a lot of regulatory and redistributive policies. It had to. It requires a lot of administration decision-making and judgment. Your discretionary. Administrators have tremendous discretionary judgment, actually. They may not realize that. Probably, it sounds very strange to students, but probably the most powerful person on a campus at TSU is actually not the president or the provost. It's actually probably the department chair. It really is. Because department chairs have tremendous power to get students through the process if they wanted to. Tremendous power. They can find ways that students can graduate and get done on time that even the president or the provost may not be able to figure out. So when you want to work and try to get done in your degree program, it's always a good idea to talk to Dr. Adams, who's the MPA director, and he can try to help you out. The intrusion of values and interests is something else I would like to speak to you about regarding the article. So it became evident that administration is not value-free. There are values that we all provide. Values meaning something that has some worth to it, something that makes sense. Both external political, societal, and internal, which is the organizational and professional values, they influence administrative decisions, which of course is also influenced by politics, Republican or Democrat, or outside politics, or some lobbying group. This is why, for those of you who will take my 620 course, we discuss the FDA and their decision-making process. Bureaucrats have to, of course, navigate all these competing interests and values, making choices that have significant policy implications. Why does one student, for example, get denied financial aid, but another student is given that financial aid? Who makes that decision? It's a bureaucrat somewhere in D.C., or maybe possibly in the state of Texas. This reality is then reflected in the shift from viewing public administration as a purely technical field to one that becomes inherently political. And that is where we actually are today, in a sense, even though it's like a cycle, basically, right? Because what they're saying is in the article, Holz and Gabriel, they're arguing that actually nothing really has changed that much, actually. Things always are political. And they're maybe to the detriment of somebody, and maybe for the benefit of somebody else. That is not fair, but that is where politics are. Now, of course, there's theories and models of bureaucratic politics. And these are three key parts I would like to speak to you about. And I promise you may not be paying attention to any other parts of this course, but I promise you, these three things, these three theories that I'm going to speak to you about, I promise you, someday some of you are going to be in D.C., maybe in Austin, you're going to be at a cocktail party. You're having drinks maybe with a state senator or some other senator, maybe the governor, maybe even the president. And I promise you, this is great cocktail chatter. I promise you that. It may not sound like that, but I promise you, this is great cocktail chatter. So there's three theories that as a public administrator, when you leave this program, you should know. Iron triangles. This theory has been around probably for at least 100 years, if not more. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that is. In some public administration programs such as mine, at Pembroke and at Rutgers, we discussed it as the cozy iron triangle, because everybody's very cozy with themselves. And it's a graph, you look it up online, and it's an iron triangle, and it's made up of three different parts. There's legislatures, political representatives, the president, Congress, for example. There's the lobbyist group, the interest groups, and then there is, of course, the bureaucrats. And when you go online and look it up, the graphs, you'll see they all intersect and work together. The lobbyists give money to the politicians to get elected. In return, the politicians try to pass favorable policies and laws for the interest groups. A good example, of course, is fracking, right? The oil industry. People always complain about oil industry, but that's one example. The bureaucrats, of course, they get funding increased funding from the politicians. Congress has to authorize. Congress has the power of the purse. They have to authorize the money to the bureaucrats like the FDA or the Department of Interior, for example, who regulates oil and gas in the United States, for example. And in return, the lobbyists and the bureaucrats, they work together to try to solve problems. So a good example could be, for example, some oil pipeline explodes out in Dakota. Well, OSHA and other regulatory agencies, the Department of Interior, for example, they will work together, whoever those regulatory agencies are. But they will work together to try to fix the problem as fast as they can. And there's interest on both sides. On all three sides, there's all interest. Politicians, of course, want to keep getting elected. Bureaucrats want to keep getting more money for their programs and for the departments. And lobbyists would like to have easier rules to work with for their constituents, for their companies. So everybody gets a piece of the action. That is just unfortunately how it is. And if you don't believe me, you can look it up. These are closed policy systems where the agency, legislative committees, and the interest groups collaborate to shape their own policy in a mutually beneficial way. Other examples are, of course, food, for example, junk food, not regulated. Some places have tried to. Advocacy coalitions and issue networks. This is the second theory I would like you to remember. They're much more open. They have very fluid arrangements involving multiple stakeholders and knowledge-based arguments. That's the second type that you come across, which a good example could be what's going on today with abortion. Advocacy coalitions on both sides and issue networks. The garbage can model is the third theory that's probably the most important one. This is a decision-making process that's very chaotic. It's very chaotic where problem, solutions, and participants, they interact in unpredictable ways. They don't have any predictable manner in which they can interact. So this is a very, very difficult type of, and a very different type of model. But the most important one, if you ever forget, is the cozy iron triangle. Now, let me talk a little bit about the critics. So, for example, there's a guy named Theodore Lowy. He was a very famous political scientist and public administrator. These agencies have these very broad discretionary power. And the discretionary power is something that it can be turned on a whim. It doesn't make any sense why one person gets super financial aid and another person does not get super financial aid. He argued, for example, Dr. Lowy, that excessive delegation of power to bureaucrats, it undermines the constitutional checks and balances, leading to interest group liberalism and a dilution of legislative authority. What his argument was saying that what Congress or the state legislators may have done was they've outsourced their responsibility to these bureaucratic organizations, these government organizations. But they shouldn't have done that. They should not have done that, actually. Because what they're doing is they're actually harming the U.S. Constitution because they're giving away their power, which he's against that, of course. Some defenders who are okay with this type of theory, the three ones I mentioned, they, of course, emphasize that, look, the legislature cannot do everything. And when laws are written and it's challenged, it goes to the Supreme Court or the state court. And it's challenged over there, and the state court, Supreme Court will then make a ruling based on how they interpret the law. And their interpretation may be very different than what the legislature's intended, but it's there, and everybody has to accept it. Now, the last part I would like to speak to you about would be the decision-making styles in policymaking. The rational comprehensive model advocates for logical, all-encompassing decision-making, but it is often impractical due to information and resource constraints. There is no possible way that I, myself, or any professor at TSU knows everything they can know about their discipline and their field of study. It is not possible. It is not possible. Therefore, the argument also is that it can't be possible for bureaucrats to know everything. They have to make satisficing decisions on a daily basis. They just can't. So the incrementalist is another type, with what's called muddling through. And if those of you take my class at 620, we may discuss a guy named Charles Lindblom, who was known for a very famous article that was published probably about 70, 80 years ago called The Science of Muddling Through, in which he discussed the purpose of incrementalism, whereby people just simply kept making up more and more decisions on a very small, timely manner. So small baby steps to change something. That is something that also goes on in public administration quite a lot. Now, of course, there are practical implications, which are that public administrators are expected to balance their technical expertise with political acumen, meaning their political savviness. There are ethical considerations, obviously, as to why, for example, one student gets financial aid and another student does not get financial aid. What was the reason for that? And there's a responsiveness to all the diverse stakeholders. That's why Congress will sometimes hold hearings and call in the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State or Social Security and grill them on television and say, why did you do this? What was the reason for that? What are your safety precautions? Security, etc., etc. You'll see this many, many times in the coming years. The budgeting process is also a policy tool. If for those of you who take my budgeting class, as a plug I can make it, we will discuss budgeting more in detail. But understand something and understand very well, because this is also something I'd like students to take away from this course, if you can. And someday you'll be, like I said, having cocktails with the president possibly. Budgeting is also a policy process. It's a policy process. When you look at the budget that the U.S. Senate and the Congress, the Congress and the U.S. Senate come together, which is what's going on right now in this time under Trump, they argue, they argue about the budget. How much should be allocated to DOD? How much to the CIA? How much to Social Security? Those are all policy considerations. It's all considerations where they have to argue and they have to negotiations and that's why it takes a long time. The budget is generally, just like in the state of Texas, it's a 2-year cycle. And the same thing goes to U.S. Congress and the Senate, then it goes to the president's desk. It's also a 2-year cycle. So 2 years, they put the budget ahead, they do the budgeting, they figure out how much money is going to come in from taxpayers that will generate enough revenue to cover what we want to get done. Maybe we can cut back here, we can cut back there. That's why they have tax cuts. There's other reasons for that, of course. But that is a 2-year cycle. That's a big deal. So budgeting itself is a policy process that administrators are expected to get a part of. Now, of course, the last part I would like to discuss is idea number 3 in conclusion. Of course, it represents a very mature understanding of public administration as a dynamic, value-laden, and politically engaged field. It moves beyond the simplistic notion of neutral expertise, emphasizing the complexity of governance in modern democracies, which all democracies go through this. I would even dare say that even authoritarian regimes go through this to some degree, because of course, in authoritarian regimes, bureaucrats are probably the most powerful people you could find, because they rely solely on discretionary judgment. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. That's what's probably going on in China right now, in communist China. They have to navigate competing interests, again, back to lobbyists and interest groups, and they have to make decisions that have very profound impacts on society. So we will pick this up on idea number 5, and thank you again for your time. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture.